The laughter spread through the auction house like a wave the moment Dean Mercer raised his paddle. It wasn't the polite kind of laughter people swallow in public. It was the open, unrestrained kind that comes when someone does something so obviously foolish that no one feels the need to be kind about it. The Aston Martin DB9, sitting at the far end of the warehouse, had been there since the lot opened at 7 that morning, collecting exactly 0 serious interest and attracting nothing more than a few photographs from people who had no intention of bidding. It sat under a single yellowed fluorescent bulb, covered in a layer of dust thick enough to write your name in, its hood slightly ajar, one rear quarter panel bearing a long surface scratch that nobody had bothered to explain. 3 dealerships had already looked at it and walked away. 2 private collectors had requested inspection reports and never called back. The auction house had quietly lowered the reserve twice before Dean ever walked through the door. Tyler Knox, standing near the front with his arms folded across his chest and a coffee going cold in his hand, watched Dean's paddle go up and shook his head slowly. "That thing's worth more as scrap metal," he said, loud enough for the people around him to hear, and a few of them laughed again, the comfortable laugh of people who believe they understand the situation entirely. Claire Vaughn, standing 2 rows back in a blazer the color of storm clouds, said nothing. She just watched Dean with the careful, measuring expression of someone trying to figure out whether they were witnessing a man make the best or the worst decision of his life. The auctioneer's gavel came down, $1,000. Dean Mercer had just bought a dead car. Why did the bidding stop at 1,000? Because the Aston Martin DB9 in that warehouse had been officially declared non-restorable by 2 separate certified mechanics, both of whom had submitted written assessments describing an engine with irreparable electrical faults, a seized transmission, and a cooling system that had apparently been run without fluid for an unknown and significant length of time. The auction house had attached both assessments directly to the lot description, which was either admirably transparent or the primary reason the car had sat there unloved since 7 that morning. Probably both. There was a note, almost as an afterthought, at the bottom of the second document, mentioning that the vehicle's original service history was incomplete and that some internal components appeared to be non-standard, though the assessors had attributed this to previous owner modifications rather than anything of particular significance. Dean had read all of this the night before on his phone, while Sadie finished her homework at the kitchen table, her pencil moving in the steady rhythm of someone solving problems that have correct answers. She'd looked up once and asked what he was reading. He'd said, "A car nobody wants." She'd considered this for a moment and then gone back to her math. The morning of the auction, she'd stood at the door in her school uniform and told him to be careful with the savings, and he'd kissed the top of her head and promised he would. $1,000 was, at that point, almost everything left in the account he'd been quietly building over 14 months of weekend work and carefully deferred expenses, groceries bought in smaller quantities, a heating bill paid week late, a jacket repair postponed until spring. Tyler Knox would later describe Dean's purchase as the kind of decision that makes you wonder if the guy knows something everyone else missed, or if he's just genuinely lost it. He said this to 3 different people over the course of that afternoon, and each time he said it, the tone left no ambiguity about which possibility he believed. The drive back to the house took 40 minutes with the DB9 secured on a flatbed. Dean sat in the cab of the tow truck and barely said a word. The driver, a quiet man named Darnell, who had been hauling broken vehicles across that county for 11 years and had long since stopped asking questions about the stories behind them, glanced over once and remarked that the car looked like it had a history. Dean said most things did. Sadie was already home when the flatbed turned onto their street, standing in the front yard still in her school uniform, watching the enormous shape of the DB9 materialize under its tarp like something being delivered from a different world entirely. She walked around the flatbed twice before Dean climbed down from the cab, pressing her hands against the tarp at different points, feeling the shape of the car beneath the fabric, the smooth sweep of the roofline, the particular curve of the front fenders that Aston Martin had spent years and considerable argument making look effortless. "It feels expensive," she said. Dean pulled the tarp back from the hood, and they both looked at the car together in the late afternoon light. Whatever it had been through, the neglect, the failed inspections, the public dismissals, the 2 lowered reserves, and the laughter at the auction, it still looked like something. It still had that indefinable quality of a thing made with serious intention. The dust couldn't take that away. The scratches couldn't. He put his hand flat on the hood the same way she had, feeling the warmth the metal had gathered through the tarp during the drive, and he said quietly, almost to the car rather than to his daughter, "Cars don't die. People give up on them." Sadie looked at him for a long moment. Then she went inside to start dinner, because she was 11 years old and already understood that some things her father needed to say out loud, and the best thing she could do for him was let him say them without turning it into a conversation. The garage at the back of Dean's property was not, strictly speaking, a professional workspace. It was a single-car structure with a concrete floor that had cracked along 2 diagonal lines, a sliding door that required both hands and a specific technique involving a slight upward lift to open without jamming, and an electrical panel that Dean had replaced himself 2 summers ago, when the original one had started making a sound he described as optimistic about outcomes it had no business being optimistic about. The walls were lined with shelves he'd built from reclaimed timber over the course of several weekends, holding tools arranged with a precision that seemed genuinely at odds with the general condition of everything else in the structure. There was a workbench along the back wall built from a solid door blank on sawhorses, a wheeled stool with a seat, repaired twice with duct tape, and a trouble light on an extended cord that Dean had been meaning to replace with something permanent for approximately 3 years. This was where the Aston Martin DB9 now lived, filling the space so completely that Dean had to move sideways to get between the car and the shelving. Naomi, who lived 4 houses down and had never spoken to Dean about anything except the state of the sidewalk in front of his property during leaf season, stopped at the open garage door on the 3rd morning and stood there looking at the car for what seemed like a long time. "Is that thing staying?" she asked. Dean said it was. Naomi nodded slowly, the way people nod when the answer confirms what they already suspected, and went home and filed a complaint with the neighborhood association, which generated a formal letter that arrived 6 days later, citing aesthetic concerns and a storage clause that she had clearly spent time locating specifically for this situation. Brooke Hartley, who chaired the association with a seriousness of purpose that Dean found genuinely impressive even when it was directed at him, followed up with a phone call in which she suggested, in the measured tone of someone who has done this before, that an Aston Martin in progressive states of disassembly was not consistent with the neighborhood's visual standards. Dean thanked her for calling and returned to the garage. He started with the engine, not because it was the most logical entry point. Any properly conducted professional assessment would have begun with a full diagnostic sweep, a systematic mapping of every system before anything was touched. But because Dean had learned, over years that he didn't talk about much anymore, that an engine communicates everything about the life it's had if you approach it with patience and the right kind of attention. He removed the cam covers first, working deliberately, not out of caution but out of the habit of observation, of letting what he found tell him what he was looking at rather than deciding in advance. The components inside were not what he expected. There were parts here that had no place in a standard DB9 production model, not aftermarket modifications, not components swapped from another vehicle by someone who understood only approximate compatibility, but precision-engineered pieces manufactured to tolerances that the standard production line had never worked to. The kind of tolerances you found in prototype development. The kind you found in units that were never intended to reach a dealership floor. Dean sat back on his stool and looked at what he was looking at for a long time without speaking or moving. Then he extracted a single assembly from a section of the engine block that standard documentation said should have contained something entirely different. A compact, dense configuration of components that shouldn't have been there, and turned it under the light. The architecture was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. A hybrid mechanical system, not electrical, not a conventional regenerative configuration, but a purely mechanical integration, designed to recapture and redirect energy through precision-engineered components operating in direct concert with the combustion cycle. He had seen something like this before. He had seen the drawings for it. He had been in the room when some of those drawings were made, and he had been the person arguing, unsuccessfully, that what was in those drawings deserved to be finished. He set the component down carefully on a clean cloth and sat with that knowledge for a while, and the garage was very quiet around him. Claire Vaughn pulled up outside on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after the auction, ostensibly because she'd been driving past on her way home from a press event and seen the lights on. This was not entirely untrue, but also not the complete account of her reasoning. She had been thinking about Dean Mercer and his $1,000 dead car more than was professionally appropriate for someone with no stake in the transaction. She was an automotive journalist with 9 years of experience, and over those 9 years she'd developed a reasonably reliable sense of when a surface story was sitting on top of a different and more significant story, the way ice sits on water. She leaned in the garage doorway and watched Dean work for a few minutes without announcing herself, observing the way he moved around the car. Unhurried, but not aimless, with the specific economy of motion of someone who is always thinking 3 steps ahead of what his hands are doing. He acknowledged her without apparent surprise and said she could come in. She stepped inside and looked at the engine components laid out along the workbench, each on its own cloth, each tagged with a small handwritten label, arranged in a spatial sequence she couldn't decode, but that clearly represented a coherent system of thought. "Tyler Knox says you don't know what you're doing," she said, because she was a journalist and direct questions worked better than tentative ones. Dean picked up one of the labeled components and held it under the light. "Tyler Knox has never opened one of these," he said. She asked what he was looking for. He was quiet long enough that she wondered if he was going to answer. Then he said, "I'm looking for what they didn't want anyone to find." The prototype was real. That was the part that took Claire the longest to process, because prototypes didn't end up at auction houses. They didn't get assessed at scrap value by lot houses in unremarkable towns on a Tuesday morning and sold for $1,000 to a man who'd read the listing on his phone while his daughter did homework. They got destroyed at the end of their useful life, or locked into secure long-term storage, or absorbed back into corporate holdings when the program that had generated them was discontinued and the files were sealed. The idea that one had simply slipped through, that a chain of corporate transfers and organizational reshufflings and inadequate documentation had allowed a classified development vehicle to drift invisibly from internal fleet to used car lot to auction warehouse without anyone along that chain recognizing what it was an accident of a scale that wasn't supposed to be possible. But the automobile industry was, underneath its carefully managed public image, an organization of human beings making decisions under time pressure with incomplete information, and incomplete information had its own momentum. The DB9 in Dean Mercer's garage had been built around an experimental hybrid mechanical system developed during a classified engineering program from the mid-2000s, a program whose existence had never been publicly acknowledged in any company communication, press release, or industry document. The system represented a fundamentally different approach to energy recovery than anything the industry was pursuing commercially at the time. Not a battery architecture, not a conventional regenerative braking system, but a precision mechanical integration operating at the level of the engine itself, extracting and redirecting energy through components, machined to tolerances that the production line didn't attempt. The program had been terminated after a catastrophic failure during high-load testing destroyed one of the prototypes. The project had been closed, the documentation sealed, and the remaining development units formally accounted for and disposed of. Except, apparently, one. This wasn't a failed engine, Dean said one evening, setting down a component and looking at it on the cloth in front of him with an expression that was something between professional assessment and something older. It was an unfinished idea. There's a difference. He decided that night, in the quiet of the garage after Sadie had gone to sleep, to rebuild the prototype. Not to restore it to its original condition, not to recreate what Aston Martin had abandoned, but to complete the development that had been interrupted, to find the correction he had outlined in a document that had gone unread, and to see what the idea became when it was allowed to finish. Dean had not always worked out of a cracked concrete garage in a mid-sized suburban neighborhood. This was the part of the story that Claire uncovered gradually, over weeks, through conversations with Dean that started as interviews and became something less formal, and through the kind of quiet background research that a journalist undertakes when she suspects the surface of a story is the least interesting part of it. Dean Mercer had spent 6 years as a powertrain development engineer at a prestigious automotive company, the last 3 of them in a division that did not appear in the public organizational chart and whose work was not discussed outside the building. He had left the industry, left it entirely, without transferring, without taking another position, without consulting anyone about the decision after his wife Paige died. Sadie had been 4 years old. Dean had gone home for the funeral and looked at his life from the outside for the first time in years, and the version he saw didn't include returning to a position in another city while raising a 4-year-old on his own. And something in him had also gone very quiet when Paige went. Something that had been the animating force of his professional ambition. And without it, he couldn't locate a reason to maintain the velocity at which he'd been moving. He'd done contract work for a while, the kind of specialized technical consulting that pays well enough and requires enough focus to serve as a reasonable substitute for a life. Then less of that. Then weekend jobs, supplemented by careful management of what remained. He'd stayed current in the field because he couldn't help it. It was the architecture of his thinking had been since he was a teenager taking apart motorcycles in a rented storage unit, but he'd kept it private because nobody in his neighborhood had a reason to know that the man whose garage accumulating HOA violations had once sat in rooms where diagrams were drawn for systems that didn't exist yet. Sadie said, one of the evenings when Claire stayed long enough that they all ended up eating takeout together at the kitchen table, Dad only smiles around engines. She said it with the neutral certainty of someone reporting a fact that she considered unremarkable, and Dean heard it from across the table and looked down at his food without responding, and then changed the subject to something Sadie had done at school, and Claire wrote the line in her notebook later that night, sitting in her car in the dark, before she drove home. The engine started for the first time on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of work. Not powerfully, it caught and ran for 4 seconds before dying, but it caught and it ran. and the sound it made in those 4 seconds was unlike anything Dean had heard from a production vehicle in his recent memory. Dense and layered, with a harmonic beneath the combustion note that was the mechanical hybrid system beginning, tentatively and incompletely, to function in its intended relationship with the engine. Not a malfunction, not an anomaly, but the first hint of the design behavior. Sadie had been doing homework on the workbench, as she often did when Dean was working late, and she looked up sharply when she heard it. Dean was completely still for a moment after the engine died. He made a small adjustment, checked 2 connections with the methodical efficiency of someone who has already thought through which variables are in play, and started it again. This time it ran for 11 seconds before he let it settle back into silence. He sat on the stool and pressed both palms flat on his knees and breathed slowly, and the garage was very quiet. The car wasn't finished. There were weeks of work ahead, calibration, tuning, a dozen systems that needed attention, a recalibration of the hybrid integration that would require careful testing at increments. But the engine had started, which meant it hadn't been a dead car. It had been all along a car that nobody had understood well enough to finish. Naomi had the kind of instinct for significant moments that expressed itself as a practical inability to remain indoors when something interesting was happening on her street, and she filmed the first proper extended start on her phone from approximately 12 feet away, without asking, with the steady hand and clean audio of someone who had taken this kind of footage before, even if she couldn't have explained why. She uploaded it the same evening with the caption, "My neighbor bought a dead Aston Martin for $1,000, and I think it just started." The automotive community found the video within 6 hours, the way the automotive community always finds things, through a specific network of forums and enthusiast channels that operate largely outside the mainstream, where people who know what they're looking at circulate information with a speed and precision that larger media organizations have never quite managed to replicate. By the following morning, the video had moved beyond the enthusiast spaces into the wider automotive press, where the nature of the car, the non-standard components visible even in the phone footage, the acoustic signature of that start, which 3 separate engineers in separate comment threads identified independently as unlike any production DB9 they'd heard, began generating questions that the footage itself couldn't answer. Naomi texted Dean a link and then a separate apology, in that order, both messages arriving within 40 seconds of each other. Dean looked at his phone for a long time, standing at the workbench in the garage with the DB9 idling softly behind him. He looked up and out through the open garage door at the gray autumn sky, at the neighborhood going about its evening in the middle distance, and said nothing for a while. He hadn't been thinking about any of this. He'd been thinking about the car, about the calibration work that was still ahead, about a specific tolerance adjustment in the hybrid integration that he was going to need to resolve before the next test cycle. "I just wanted to hear it breathe again," he told Claire when she called him that evening. She asked how the car sounded when it ran. He described it for 10 uninterrupted minutes, and she listened to all of it without asking any questions, and the journalist part of her and the part of her that was just paying attention were, for once, doing exactly the same thing. Collectors started arriving within the week, not in numbers, not all at once. It was the gradual accumulation that reputation makes when it travels through a world that's small enough to have real word of mouth. A man named Gerald, who described himself carefully as semi-retired from the industry, and who arrived on a Saturday morning with no advance notice, stood outside the open garage door for 20 minutes before Dean acknowledged him and invited him in. Gerald said very little. He stood in front of the engine with the expression of a person who is identifying something they have been told, in specific terms, does not exist. He left after 40 minutes without asking about purchasing anything. There was nothing to purchase, but he called someone from the car on his drive home, and that person called someone else that same evening, and the circle expanded with the quiet efficiency of a world where trust operates through direct personal recommendation and nothing else. Within the following week, Dean had received 4 unsolicited inquiries about the vehicle, 2 of which arrived with numbers attached that he'd looked at once and set aside. Tyler Knox, whose dealership specialized in high-end European imports and who had been one of the more audible presences at the auction, heard about the collector interest and drove past the garage on 2 separate occasions without stopping. Claire observed him from her parked car on the second occasion, recognizing his vehicle, and noted his continued presence at the edge of events as something worth watching. Brooke Hartley's HOA complaint, still technically pending review, acquired a new dimension when she arrived at Dean's door with a revised version of the original letter that now included a newly discovered clause about commercial activity in residential zones. Dean accepted the letter with the same neutral courtesy with which he had accepted the first 2 and filed it in the folder with the others. The contact from Aston Martin arrived through Claire's professional email on a Tuesday morning, shaped in the form of a carefully worded inquiry from a senior legal representative asking whether Dean would be willing to discuss the vehicle's provenance and technical composition in a confidential setting at a mutually agreeable time. Claire read it twice before forwarding it to Dean with no additional commentary. Then she printed it and read it a third time at her desk. The language was precise in a way that told her something important. They knew what the car was. They had watched the footage, and someone inside the organization with sufficient institutional memory had connected what they saw in that garage with a program that had been formally closed over a decade ago. And now there was a conversation that needed to happen, and the shape of that conversation had not yet been settled. Tyler Knox, operating separately and with less restraint, had made a series of pointed claims on an industry forum 2 days earlier that stopped just short of direct accusation but arranged its implications carefully enough that several people who read it took the meaning clearly. He suggested the components in Dean's car represented proprietary technology that had been improperly transferred and that the vehicle's purchase chain deserved scrutiny. Claire spent 40 minutes composing a response that was factual, meticulously sourced, and clinically effective, and then she sent it to her editor rather than posting it, because she had something more considered and more permanent in mind than a forum exchange. The garage inspection arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of 2 men in separate vehicles who were affiliated with a licensing authority that had never previously had occasion to contact Dean, and whose appearance at this specific moment was, as Dean noted to Claire that evening with characteristic understatement, not a coincidence that required extensive analysis to understand. Sadie was at school. Dean answered every question fully and without any visible agitation, presenting the vehicle's complete auction documentation, both original assessment reports, the lot purchase receipt showing the price and date, and his own records, meticulous, organized, dating from the day the car arrived, of every component he had identified, removed, cataloged, and worked on. The 2 men spent 2 hours in the garage. They left without issuing any citation and without making any specific finding. What they found was a man with a complete and coherent documented record, an unambiguous legal chain of custody for every piece of a vehicle purchased legitimately at a public auction with public documentation. What they had expected to find, Dean suspected, was something rather different. Brooke Hartley filed a 3rd notice the same afternoon, this one citing an exterior lighting ordinance that Dean resolved within 48 hours by replacing a single bulb at the garage entrance. Claire published a piece the following morning. It was 3,000 words long, carefully structured, sourced to documentation she had obtained through her own research over the preceding weeks, and it told the full story. The vehicle's history, the nature of the prototype system it had been built around, the classified development program, the question of how a vehicle that should have been formally decommissioned had arrived at a public auction house. She named the corporate legal contact. She cited Tyler Knox's forum posts with their dates and original text. She did not editorialize. The piece generated more traffic in its first 24 hours than anything she had published in 2 years. That same evening, Dean told Claire something he hadn't told her before, that he had spent 3 years inside the organization arguing against the termination of the hybrid program, that he had submitted 2 formal written dissents, neither of which had received a substantive response, that the catastrophic test failure, the event that had officially ended the program, had been, in his documented professional judgment, the result of a specific implementation error rather than a fundamental design problem. An error that was identifiable, correctable, and that he had outlined a detailed correction for in a document that had been acknowledged as received and then, apparently, filed without further action. Because by then the institutional investment in a different technical direction had grown past the point where a correction could be made without consequences that affected too many people and too many prior decisions. He said this with a neutrality that Claire found more striking than anger would have been. He said it the way a person recites a sequence of events that are facts rather than grievances. He said, "They buried the project because it threatened too many people." She had heard him say it before. She understood it differently now. The Detroit Automotive Expo took place on a Friday in November, and Claire had secured Dean's invitation through a combination of her standing in the industry and the simpler fact that at this point his name was the most discussed in the automotive press, and the Expo's organizers had noticed. Dean considered declining for several days. He talked through the question with Sadie over 3 evenings at the kitchen table, laying out the reasons on both sides with the methodical fairness he applied to most things, and Sadie listened to him work her through both arguments twice and then said, with the unapologetic directness of someone who had not yet learned to hedge, "Go, Dad. Let them see it." Dean looked at her for a moment across the table. Then he told Claire he would come. Tyler Knox was attending the expo in an official capacity as part of a European imports showcase, and when he saw Dean's name on the attendee list, he made no public comment. The people around him noticed, however, the particular texture of his silence on the subject, the slightly too measured quality of it, and they understood that he was waiting for something. He had been constructing, in his own mind, a version of events in which Dean's appearance at Detroit would expose the gap, the technical overreach, the incomplete understanding, the single flaw in the narrative that would snap the story back into a shape he could recognize. He'd been looking for that gap since the auction, since the morning Tyler had raised his coffee and said "scrap metal," and the room had laughed. He was still looking for it. Dean drove the Aston Martin to the expo under its own power. The sound arrived before the car was visible, that layered, harmonically dense note that people who had watched the footage recognized immediately, and people who hadn't found difficult to categorize, because it sat in a register between sports car and something else, something that suggested mechanical processes operating in concert rather than sequence. The car came through the loading entrance and rolled into the center of the main exhibition floor and stopped, and the room went quiet. Not the polite, attentive quiet of a presentation about to begin, but the specific quality of silence that happens when a group of people simultaneously recalibrate their expectations of what they're looking at. Dean stepped out of the car. He was wearing the same jacket he wore in the garage. He hadn't dressed for the occasion in any way that acknowledged it as one. He stood beside the car and let the room look, because the car was the thing, and he understood that clearly. A senior powertrain engineer from a major European manufacturer, a man with 30 years of development history, and a name attached to a number of foundational patents, was the first to approach. He walked around the car slowly, the full circumference, twice. He crouched near the front wheel well to look at the roofline from a lower angle, which is a specific gesture that engineers make when they are trying to understand how a shape achieves an effect that isn't immediately obvious from standing height. He straightened up and looked at Dean directly. "Where did you rebuild this?" he asked. Dean's answer was immediate and unembellished. "Behind my house, between school pickups and overdue bills." The room absorbed this. The engineer nodded, slowly, with the expression of someone for whom the answer had clarified something larger than the specific question asked. He asked if he could examine the engine. Dean opened the hood. The room gathered around it. Engineers, collectors, journalists, manufacturer representatives, and the conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours and was conducted almost entirely in the precise, technical language of people who are looking at something they hadn't expected to be real. Tyler Knox stood near the entrance of the main hall for most of this, and watched the gathering grow. He watched it absorb nearly every technical presence in the room. He finished his drink, set the glass down on a standing table, and walked out through the entrance he'd come in. Claire saw him leave from her position near the car. She didn't follow him. She was watching Dean explain the hybrid mechanical integration to a group that included 3 engineers who had each, independently, spent parts of their careers trying to solve related problems, and the quality of the conversation, the way Dean moved through it, the unhurried precision of his language, the way the engineers leaned slightly forward when he described the correction he'd made to the implementation error, looked to her like something she had been trying to describe for weeks and could now simply point to. An Aston Martin technical director approached Dean near the end of the main demonstration and extended his hand and said something that Claire couldn't hear from where she was standing. Dean nodded. He didn't look like a man who had won something. He looked like a man who had completed something and understood there was a difference. The Mercer garage became, in the months that followed, the kind of destination that exists in the collector world as something between a workshop and a quietly held conviction. The sort of place that's mentioned in the specific, lowered tone reserved for things people consider genuinely rare. Dean didn't advertise. He didn't build a website or return the media inquiries that arrived in the weeks following Detroit. He took on 3 vehicles over the following 6 months, all referred by word of mouth, all of them cars with unusual histories and undocumented modifications that other workshops had declined to examine properly. He worked on each of them with the same methodical attention he'd given the DB9. He didn't work quickly, and he didn't work cheaply, and the people who understood what he was doing had no complaint with either condition. Gerald came back twice, once with a car and once simply to talk about a problem he'd been thinking about, and Dean found this a more natural use of an afternoon than most alternatives. The technical paper that Claire co-wrote with 2 engineers she had met at Detroit, documenting the hybrid mechanical system, its original development context, the implementation error that had ended the program, and the reconstruction, was published in an industry journal that 4 of the 5 major automotive manufacturers subscribed to. The paper cited the original development program by name. It identified the implementation error. It reproduced, with Dean's permission, a section of his formal dissent from 11 years earlier, the one that had been acknowledged as received and never answered. It did not ask for a response. It did not need one. The HOA complaint was formally withdrawn on a Thursday in December. Brooke Hartley's letter of withdrawal cited resolution of relevant concerns, which Dean read once, standing at the kitchen counter with his coffee, and then placed in the recycling. Naomi arrived that same evening with a casserole and an apology for the video, which Dean accepted in the order they were offered. She met Sadie, who showed her the labeled component shelf with an authority that came from 11 months of watching and learning, and explained, in terms that were more accurate than most adults could have managed, what a hybrid mechanical integration was and why it mattered. Naomi listened with genuine interest and asked 3 follow-up questions, each of which Sadie answered without hesitation. Claire came by the garage on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks before Christmas, when the light was low and horizontal and the color of something kept warm for a long time. The DB9 was parked outside for the first time since Dean had finished it. Fully detailed, its silver paint reflecting the winter afternoon in long, slow curves that moved across the concrete as the sun shifted. Dean was at the workbench inside, working on something unrelated to the Aston Martin, and Sadie was sitting in the driver's seat of the car with the door open and her feet hanging out, pressing dashboard controls with the systematic curiosity of someone conducting research. Claire stood at the edge of the driveway and looked at all of it: the car, the afternoon light, the garage with its worn sliding door and its shelves of labeled components and its duct-taped stool, the man at the workbench who had bought a dead car for $1,000 at an auction where people laughed at him, and rebuilt it into the most discussed vehicle in his industry, and done it between school pickups and overdue bills and a folder of HOA notices accumulating in a kitchen drawer. "You rebuilt a car the industry gave up on," she said. Dean was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking through the way he wanted to answer. He looked out at Sadie, who had found the glove compartment release and was opening and closing it with the satisfaction of someone who has discovered a mechanism she likes. Then he picked up a small component from the bench, a bolt he'd been threading, nothing significant, and turned it in his fingers. "No," he said. "I rebuilt the reason I kept going." The afternoon light moved across the hood of the Aston Martin and threw a long, warm line of reflection across the garage floor and up the near wall. Sadie laughed at the sound of the glove compartment, a clean and unguarded sound, and it carried out into the street and down the block and into the late December afternoon like something that had been waiting for a very long time for the right moment to be heard. The sign above the garage door had been there for 3 weeks. Sadie had painted it herself on a piece of timber she'd selected from the off-cut pile behind the shelving, using paint she'd found at the back of the tool cabinet and a brush she'd decided was the right size after testing 2 others. She had shown it to Dean before hanging it, holding it flat in both hands so he could read it straight on. He'd looked at it for a moment and then told her it was perfect, and she'd gone to get the ladder before he could say anything else. The letters were deliberate and slightly uneven and completely legible. Dead cars welcome. 3 people had already called about it. Dean had taken all 3 calls, because that was the kind of garage this had always been. Not a showroom, not a destination for people looking to be impressed, but a place where broken things came to be understood, and where understanding them, fully and without shortcuts, was the only work that had ever felt worth doing. He had started each of those calls the same way, by asking the person to describe what they'd heard from the car before it stopped. What it sounded like, what it felt like, because that was where the story always started, not at the breakdown, before it.
Kind of hard for me, LOL, because of my teammates. Baby Thanos don't play. That is 100% Baby Thanos, bro. What's up, Dang Prime? How you doing? It's a tough fight, but it's good. Oh, I missed that. Get a couple sparks out of that. You stream for a living, bro? Not yet. I would love to. I stream full time, like hours wise, but I also work, I guess technically full time at a real job too then. But I wouldn't call this working, bro. This is having fun. But yeah, I would love to have this be the source of my income. God damn it, bro. He took literally all my health immediately. Oh, I just lost half my health in the first 5 seconds.